In July 2026, the FDA actually took two massive and completely unrelated actions regarding peptides, exactly 5 days apart. You probably saw the headlines, right? Almost immediately, the media incorrectly reported these as a single, sweeping policy change. So, as an explainer of this regulatory shift, we really need to clear this up. Here is exactly what happened, what didn't, and the reality of the landscape moving forward.
This right here brilliantly illustrates the core confusion. On July 23rd and 24th, an advisory committee voted exclusively on unapproved peptides. Then, literally just days later on July 28th, the FDA published draft guidances for manufacturing generic versions of already approved peptides. Yes, they share a week on the calendar, but that is it. They share absolutely no compounds, no regulatory pathways, and no decision-making bodies. None.
Just to quickly ground the science here, a peptide is simply a short chain of amino acids. It's shorter than a protein, and it basically functions as a signaling molecule in your body. Now, this category is huge. On one end, you've got fully approved medicines backed by massive clinical trials, think insulin or the GLP-1 drug semaglutide. But on the totally untested end, we have experimental substances with absolutely zero human data.
And that massive spectrum brings us directly to the July 23rd advisory vote. This vote centered entirely around something called the Section 503A bulks list. So what is this list? Well, it's a federal register of bulk drug substances that state-licensed pharmacies can legally use to compound medications when a substance doesn't have a standardized United States Pharmacopoeia monograph. Now keep in mind, getting placed on this list absolutely does not mean the drug is FDA approved. It simply establishes that the raw ingredient can legally be used to fill an individual prescription.
There's also a really crucial distinction in how these pharmacies actually operate. You see, the advisory vote applied only to 503A pharmacies. Those are facilities that mix medications for individual, named patients based on a specific prescription. That is a completely different world from a 503B outsourcing facility, which manufactures massive batches without patient-specific prescriptions under incredibly strict federal guidelines. So to be clear, approving a substance for a 503A pharmacy does not authorize large-scale 503B production.
Okay, the crucial point here is exactly how the committee voted on these 7 unapproved peptides, because the margins were razor thin. BPC-157 evaluated for ulcerative colitis, KPV for wound healing and inflammation, and TB-500 for wound healing all narrowly passed by just an 8-6 margin with one abstention. MOTSC for obesity and osteoporosis, CMAX for cerebral ischemia and migraine, and Epitalin for insomnia also scraped by. But amideltide, evaluated for opioid withdrawal and insomnia, that one was outright rejected 7-6. Literally every single vote was a nail-biter.
Now here is an absolutely crucial detail that is constantly getting overlooked. Every single winning vote was tied to a highly specific medical indication. For example, BPC-157 was evaluated strictly for ulcerative colitis, period. The committee made absolutely no findings regarding tendon repair or joint recovery, which ironically are the exact uses driving massive consumer demand right now.
Which naturally brings us to the most common question. So, are BPC-157 and TB-500 legal right now? The short answer? No. Neither substance is an approved drug, and neither has been officially added to the Section 503A bulks list. The committee's vote is strictly advisory. The recommendations do not legally bind the FDA in any way, they don't instantly change the law, and they certainly don't grant new compounding authority.
In fact, the FDA's own staff scientists actually strongly recommended against all 7 of these peptides, and their scientific objections were severe. First, a severe lack of human evidence. We're talking about short, inadequate studies, or in some cases, literally zero published human clinical data. Second, a huge risk of immunogenicity and anaphylaxis, because synthetic peptides can provoke serious, durable immune responses. And third, the foundational challenge of substance identity. Reviewers stated that compounds sold under a single peptide name vary so wildly in their chemical makeup that it is practically impossible to write consistent quality standards for them.
You could see this scientific tension playing out visibly within the committee itself. 8 of the members had just been appointed in June 2026. And reporting indicates many of them actually have financial or professional ties to peptide-related businesses. But there was massive pushback from the academic and clinical members. Dr. Elizabeth Rebello from the MD Anderson Cancer Center hit the nail on the head. She stated she was deeply concerned the committee was responding to market-induced demand rather than making a decision based in solid science.
What you have to realize is that this advisory vote is actually just step 3 in a long regulatory sequence. Back in 2023, the FDA placed these substances in Category 2, which flagged them for significant safety risks. Then, in April 2026, they were removed from that high-risk list. But listen, that removal merely made them eligible to be evaluated in July. It did not authorize compounding at all. The future status now depends entirely on what the FDA does next.
And the FDA essentially has two potential routes to move forward. Route 1 is formal notice and comment rulemaking, which is the standard, slower regulatory path. Route 2 is interim enforcement discretion. That's where the FDA just publicly states it won't pursue enforcement against pharmacies compounding these substances while formal rules are being drafted. There is broad pressure for wider peptide access from high-profile figures like Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which definitely increases the odds the FDA might take that faster second route, though bypassing standard rulemaking would for sure attract serious legal challenges.
But what if the FDA chooses the standard regulatory path? Well, compounding attorneys estimate it will take anywhere from 12 to 24 months from the time of the vote just to actually amend the legal register. And there's no statutory deadline governing this process. A fully regulated legal supply chain could literally be years away.
Okay, so that covers the 23rd. Now this brings us to the entirely separate FDA action that occurred on July 28th, the one that fueled so much of the media confusion. On this date, the FDA published 17 revised draft product-specific guidances. Guys, this has absolutely nothing to do with compounding pharmacies or the unapproved peptides we were just talking about. This action is strictly about instructions for generic manufacturers on bioequivalent study design for abbreviated new drug applications. It's a completely different lane.
These guidances cover 9 active ingredients across 17 fully approved products. We're talking about massive blockbuster drugs like semaglutide, which you know as Ozempic and Wegovy, and tirzepatide, found in Mounjaro and Zepbound, as well as liraglutide. The FDA is simply updating the methodology for how future generic versions of these already approved medicines should be tested. The public comment period for this completely separate docket closes on September 28, 2026.
So just to put this media confusion to rest permanently, the July 23rd vote dealt exclusively with compounding eligibility for unapproved peptides. It's governed by Section 503A and will be resolved through future rulemaking. The July 28th guidance dealt with bioequivalence methodology for generics, governed by abbreviated new drug applications and resolved through a comment docket. Any reporting conflating these two separate regulatory tracks is simply completely inaccurate.
The core friction in all of this is that consumer demand is vastly outpacing the actual clinical evidence. We have this billion-dollar telehealth, medical spa, and longevity clinic industry pushing incredibly hard for regulated access. But on the other side, professional medical bodies are demanding rigorous evidence. Bridget Groves of the American Pharmacists Association said it perfectly. Safe clinical recommendation requires good research and education on these substances, and right now, that is just completely lacking for these unapproved variants.
Furthermore, even if the FDA does authorize federal compounding down the line, it is not a blanket pass. State rules heavily dictate the reality on the ground, because compounding is enforced jointly. A federal listing does not magically compel a state board of pharmacy to permit local dispensing. Practitioners and consumers will still have to navigate a maze of separate, highly specific state-level regulations, completely regardless of what the FDA decides.
There is also a pretty harsh financial reality to consider. Even if approved, compounded preparations usually fall completely outside standard pharmacy benefit coverage, so insurance won't touch it. Current clinic pricing estimates place out-of-pocket costs at $60 to $200 per month for these unapproved peptides, and that financial burden is going to remain entirely on the consumer.
Plus, replacing the current, unverified gray market with a fully regulated supply chain introduces massive practical hurdles. True access will strictly require prescription and verified sterility. Additionally, the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding estimates that once permitted, it's going to take pharmacies anywhere from 2 to 9 months just to source the active ingredients. You cannot simply flip a switch and have these safely available overnight. It's a huge logistical undertaking.
And this lack of data directly severely impacts clinical application. Right now, absolutely no evidence-based professional dosing guidelines exist for these unapproved peptides. Because we lack robust clinical trials, major medical associations have zero published protocols for dosage amounts, no guidelines on frequency, nothing on proper cycle length, or safe recovery timelines. This is a massive gap in evidence. Currently, buyers are literally forced to determine their own protocols purely from internet community forums, operating entirely separated from actual clinical science.
There are also immediate real-world considerations to all this that remain completely unaffected by any compounding status changes. For instance, these substances are not cleared for domestic flights unless they have a legitimate prescription label. And more critically, especially for athletes, BPC-157 and TB-500 remain strictly banned by international sports anti-doping authorities. A change in federal compounding rules does absolutely nothing to change their ban status in global sports.
Looking ahead, the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee is actually scheduled to reconvene in February to consider even more peptides. So with market demand surging so wildly ahead of the actual clinical evidence, how will the FDA balance consumer access with patient safety moving forward? It's a pivotal question for the future of medicine and one that absolutely requires careful scrutiny of both the science and the regulations.